The streetlights passed in a slow, hypnotic rhythm, casting a warm amber glow across the dashboard and catching the sharp, clean edge of his jawline. He drove with one hand resting casually on the wheel, his other hand lingering near the gearshift, his fingers tapping in a light, nervous cadence that betrayed the heavy gravity pulling between us. When we finally pulled into the driveway, neither of us made a move to open the car door. He turned his head, his face half illuminated by the shadows of the night, and the way he looked at me stripped away every defense I had left. It wasn't an innocent look, nor was it the look a son gives a mother. It was entirely human, raw, and undeniable. "I meant what I said earlier," he murmured, his voice dropping to a breathless whisper. I asked him which part, even though the answer was already beating frantically in my chest. He reached over, his movements slow and deliberate, and tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering like a brand against my cheek. "You are everything to me," he said. I didn't speak, and more importantly, I didn't pull away. If you had asked me 5 years ago what my life would look like at 42, I would have confidently told you it would be stable, predictable, and safe. But life has a merciless way of redrawing the maps we once believed were permanent. I was always the cornerstone, the person everyone else leaned heavily upon. Working as a therapist, I dedicated my days to helping other people untangle the deep grief, trauma, and utter chaos of their lives. I had mastered the art of staying calm, speaking in gentle, measured tones and holding a therapeutic silence just long enough for someone to finally breathe into it. Yet, I harbored a secret I never shared with anyone. I frequently walked out of my sessions, feeling as though I was carrying the crushing weight of far more than just my client's pain. Exactly 1 year ago, my marriage completely dissolved, ending cleanly on paper with everything signed, filed, and officially over. Emotionally, however, the ending of a marriage refuses to care about the tidy nature of legal paperwork. Some mornings I would wake up and still instinctively expect to hear the heavy rumble of the garage door rising. I'd listen for the familiar jingle of metal keys being dropped unceremoniously into the ceramic bowl resting by the sink. My ex-husband, Harrison, originally Adam in the first telling of this story, had morphed into a complete stranger to me long before he actually packed his things and left. The final breaking point didn't arrive until our last night together, when his simmering anger violently snapped, and our son, Liam, who you may know as Micah, witnessed the entire terrifying display. It was in that shattered moment I finally realized that staying was no longer an act of strength. Staying was simply surrender. Liam was only 17 years old when we finally left that house. He was a quiet, profoundly thoughtful boy, far too observant for his own internal peace of mind. When we packed our bags to leave, he didn't shed a single tear. Instead, he just sat in the passenger seat, staring blankly out the car window with his jaw pulled tight and his hands resting perfectly still. A full year has passed since that fractured night. Our new home is decidedly small, a humble 2-bedroom ranch characterized by its creaky wooden floors and a front porch that is in desperate need of a fresh coat of paint. But despite its flaws, it is entirely ours. I painstakingly filled the rooms with soft, comforting things. Warm lamps casting gentle glows, fragrant lavender candles, and an assortment of second-hand rugs that don't quite match perfectly, but radiate a deep sense of comfort. Despite the fresh start, Liam remained quiet, perhaps even quieter than before. He would routinely eat his dinner with a pair of headphones draped casually around his neck, offering a polite word of thanks whenever I cooked, and simply nodding whenever I pressed him about his day at school. The emotional space lingering between us felt completely different now, creating an illusion that we were trying to speak to each other through a thick pane of glass. Still, There were subtle, beautiful signs of life beneath the surface. I would find a steaming mug of chamomile tea thoughtfully left by my bedside. I would wake up to find a soft blanket meticulously folded over me after I had unintentionally dozed off on the living room couch. Once I even caught him staring intently at an old photograph from when he was just 4 years old. A picture where he had a wide grin, cake icing smeared all over his face, and his little arms looped tightly around my neck. He didn't offer a single word when I saw him. He just continued to stare at the image, as if he were desperately trying to remember exactly who we used to be. The monumental shift, the evening that finally cracked something wide open between us, happened on a seemingly ordinary night. We were sitting together in the living room, the television flickering softly, with a muted episode of Jeopardy playing in the background. I was exhausting myself trying to finish up some clinical notes from an incredibly difficult therapy session, a grueling divorce mediation that leaves a lingering heaviness on your soul that you can't quite wash off, when Liam suddenly broke the silence. "Do you miss him?" he asked, out of nowhere. I looked up at him slowly, clarifying, "Your dad?" He simply nodded, keeping his eyes firmly fixed on the television screen. "Sometimes," I answered, honestly, "but not the man he became. I miss the version of him I married, the one who made me laugh." Liam remained completely silent for a long, heavy moment. Then, in a voice so quiet it barely disturbed the air, he admitted he wasn't like that with me. I turned my body fully toward him and whispered, "I know," allowing us to sit together in that profound stillness. It wasn't an awkward silence, it was incredibly real and deeply present. "I never wanted to take you away from him," I confessed, my voice growing even softer, "but I couldn't let him keep taking pieces of me." Liam turned his head and looked at me. He truly looked at me, and for the very first time, I witnessed a massive emotional shift register across his face. It looked like deep understanding, or perhaps even genuine forgiveness. "I get it," he said softly, and in my heart, I truly believed that he did. Later that exact same night, I discovered him fast asleep on the living room couch, curled tightly into himself, just like he used to do when he was a little kid. I gently tucked a warm blanket around his sleeping frame and stood there in the quiet darkness for a long while, just watching the steady rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. He was my son. He was my absolute anchor. We were undeniably still in the messy process of figuring everything out, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, we weren't doing it entirely alone. Just when I began to foolishly believe that our chaotic lives were finally starting to settle into a predictable rhythm, he completely upended my expectations by making me dinner. I had walked through the front door that evening fully expecting to be greeted by the usual empty silence. It had been an exceptionally long, grueling day at the clinic, the kind of emotionally draining day where the crushing weight of everyone else's psychological pain genuinely seemed to cling to my very skin. A married couple I had been actively counseling for several long months had finally spoken the devastating words that neither of them had previously wanted to admit out loud. In my profession, there are dark moments when helping people uncover the raw truth feels terrifyingly similar to gently guiding them right to the edge of a steep cliff. I exhaustedly kicked off my shoes in the small entryway and began to unbutton my winter coat, and that was exactly when the incredible aroma hit me. The distinct, mouth-watering smell of fresh garlic, earthy rosemary. There was something incredibly rich and deeply warm drifting intentionally from the direction of the kitchen. I paused in my tracks, completely bewildered. The scent filling the air certainly wasn't the familiar smell of greasy takeout containers or reheated leftovers. It was undeniably home. Cooked, it was Liam. I took a few slow, hesitant steps inside, completely unsure of what bizarre scene I was about to walk into. And there he was. He was standing confidently at the stove, the sleeves of his shirt rolled up, tightly gripping a wooden spoon in his hand, and stirring a pot with an expression of incredibly careful focus. He glanced back over his shoulder the moment he heard my footsteps. His expression was a captivating mixture, a little bit shy, but simultaneously a little bit proud. "Figured you'd be wiped," he casually offered. "Hope it is okay. I made dinner." I just stood there in the doorway, absolutely stunned into silence. "You cooked." I managed to stammer out. He offered me a modest, nonchalant half shrug. "Just something simple," he replied. But the truth was, there was absolutely nothing simple about this gesture. It was profoundly intentional. It was fundamentally kind. It was a beautiful manifestation of pure care, made completely visible through the rising steam and fragrant spices, simmering in a worn metal pot on a perfectly quiet Wednesday night. I let my heavy work bag drop carelessly to the floor and smiled. I really, genuinely smiled. It wasn't the practiced, polite smile I reserved for my therapy clients or the casual neighbors down the street. It was something profoundly softer, something infinitely more real. "That is really thoughtful, Liam," I told him. His answering smile was so genuine that it reached all the way to his eyes. "You are always the one doing everything," he noted astutely. "Thought maybe I could take a turn." We soon sat down together at the small kitchen table, just the two of us sharing the quiet space. The spaghetti he had prepared was undeniably slightly overcooked, and the edges of the garlic bread were a little too crispy for perfection. Yet, to me, the entire meal was absolutely perfect. Our knees gently brushed against one another beneath the cramped table as we ate, and for the very first time in countless months, he didn't hastily rush through his food or immediately retreat to the isolating confines of his bedroom. He actually talked. He talked openly about his classes at school. He complained about an annoying substitute teacher who adamantly kept referring to him as Michael, completely ignoring his repeated corrections. He shared a sweet story about a close friend who had deeply confided in him during their lunch period, expressing how genuinely proud he felt that he was able to simply sit, listen, and completely withhold judgment. And then, somewhere in the midst of biting into the crispy bread, he casually dropped a startling observation. "My friend Jessie thinks you are too cool to be a therapist." I couldn't help but raise an amused eyebrow at that. "Too cool," I repeated. Liam flashed a charming grin. "Yeah," he confirmed. He said most therapists look like, "I don't know, professors, you don't?" I let out a loud, genuine laugh at the comparison, and to my complete astonishment, he began to laugh right along with me. It was a quiet, almost bashful chuckle, sounding as though the joyful noise had somehow forgotten how to escape his body, and was awkwardly learning how to do so all over again. Hearing that specific laugh was absolutely everything to me. It felt exactly like the very first fragile hint of spring, finally breaking through after an agonizingly long, perpetually gray winter. Later that evening, we naturally migrated into the living room, bringing with us a battered shoebox stuffed full of old family photographs that he had dug out from the dark depths of the hall closet. The box was a time capsule of images depicting past birthdays, carefree beach trips, lazy weekend mornings where we inevitably ended up with sticky pancake batter matted in our hair. Liam slowly and methodically flipped through the worn images, looking as though he were physically walking back through the hallways of his own precious memories. He paused on one specific photo where he was around 5 years old, his entire face joyfully smeared with rich cake frosting, his mouth pulled into a massive grin, and his little arms locked tightly around my neck. "Wow," he murmured softly, holding the photograph up for me to see. "You look young." I couldn't help but smirk at his bluntness. "I was young," I corrected him. He tilted the small square of paper, studying my face in the image with intense concentration. "You haven't really changed," he declared quietly. I shot him a skeptical look. "Flattery, huh?" I teased. He immediately shook his head in earnest denial. "I mean it," he insisted. "You look happy in this one." I leaned my body slightly closer to peer at the photograph again, and I instantly realized he was completely right. That particular version of myself, the carefree, radiantly joyful woman captured in the gloss, felt like an entirely different person that I simply used to know. She was someone I hadn't properly seen in a very long time. "That was before everything turned upside down," I murmured, the weight of the past decade bleeding into my voice. Liam offered a slow, understanding nod. "When I was a kid, I thought nothing could shake you," he confessed. "You were just solid." I blinked rapidly, completely caught off guard by the depth of his observation. "It is not a bad thing," he quickly appended, rushing to clarify his words. "It is just, now I see it. How much you must have kept to yourself." Those incredibly perceptive words hit me far deeper than he could have possibly realized. In that raw moment, he wasn't merely looking at me anymore. He was truly seeing me, recognizing the hidden complexities of my pain. "You've really grown," I whispered to him, my voice thick with unshed tears. Liam looked down at his lap, the corners of his mouth lifting into a bittersweet, resigned smile. "Didn't have much choice," he replied softly. Unable to stop myself, I reached over across the small space between us, and gently tucked a stray strand of his hair neatly behind his ear, instinctively repeating an old comforting gesture from when he was just a small boy. He didn't flinch away from my touch. He didn't attempt to pull back. "I am proud of you," I told him fiercely. He lifted his eyes to meet mine, and then, without uttering a single word in response, he slowly leaned his head until it rested heavily against my shoulder. It happened just like that. There was absolutely no lingering tension. There was no need for any apology. There was only an encompassing, beautiful. We remained seated just like that for a long time, tightly wrapped in a profound silence that didn't throb with ache, but rather felt entirely whole. And it was precisely in that suspended moment that I finally realized something critical within our dynamic had irrevocably shifted. Liam wasn't just finding his way back to me as a son. We were actively finding each other again. And perhaps we were finding something substantially more. The passing days that immediately followed that evening felt noticeably lighter. The change wasn't announced in any grand, sweeping, cinematic way, but rather manifested in those tiny, everyday, mundane moments that so often go completely unnoticed, right up until the second they fundamentally change who you are. Liam began a new routine of joining me in the kitchen during the early mornings. He would quietly pour himself a steaming mug of black coffee, adding just a small splash of oat milk to temper the bitterness, and then he would come sit directly across the table from me in a beautiful, quiet companionship. He rarely spoke very much during these early hours. He simply stirred his dark cup, his eyes remaining half, lidded with the lingering weight of sleep, his broad shoulders slightly hunched in that unique, awkward in-between posture of a young boy rapidly becoming a full-grown man. But the morning silence was never heavy anymore. It was remarkably easy. It was incredibly soft. It felt exactly like we were actively learning how to comfortably breathe in the exact same matching rhythm once again. During one of these mornings, he actually burst out laughing. He genuinely laughed at a faded, funny old photograph that I had playfully pinned up on the front of our refrigerator. The picture captured him right around age 6, proudly holding a wild turtle he had excitedly discovered in our backyard, his tiny face frozen in an expression that was exactly half pure awe and half total panic. Hearing that laugh again was a revelation. It was a quiet sound, tinged with just a hint of embarrassment, but to my ears, it was absolute music. I sharply realized in that moment just how desperately I had missed hearing that beautiful sound. A few short nights later, I dragged myself home incredibly late after surviving a grueling back-to-back stretch of intense client sessions. Deep emotional fatigue clung to my weary body, exactly like a heavy second skin. I sluggishly pushed open the front door, fully expecting to step into absolute darkness. Instead, the entryway was bathed in a welcoming light, and the air was thick with the heavenly scent of something warm and nourishing, simmering nearby. Liam was standing attentively at the stove once again, though this time he was carefully preparing a pot of hot soup. His dark hair was charmingly messy, and his visual focus was entirely fixed on the task at hand. "Hey," he called out softly, without even turning his head around. "You okay?" I blinked hard, completely caught off guard by the unexpected domesticity of the scene. "Yeah, just tired," I admitted wearily. He finally turned his body to face me, offering up a remarkably gentle, reassuring smile. "Then sit," he commanded softly. "I've got it." I obediently sank into a chair at the kitchen table and silently watched him move around the cramped space. There was something so intensely deliberate about his actions. The careful, precise way he sliced up the fresh vegetables, the methodical way he stirred the broth, with unmistakable care, the thoughtful way he paused to taste the liquid and meticulously adjust the seasoning, treating the simple soup as if it truly mattered. It abruptly dawned on me that this gesture wasn't actually about the food at all. It was entirely about him choosing to give me something that I hadn't explicitly asked for, but that my soul deeply, desperately needed. Genuine care coming directly from him, aimed directly at me. We ate the hot soup quietly, our knees instinctively brushing together, once again underneath the wooden table, as if we were connected by some invisible, silent thread that was determinedly still tying our bodies together. Much later that same night, we somehow ended up outside on the front porch, tightly wrapped together in a large shared wool blanket to ward off the chill, our hands securely wrapped around steaming mugs of fragrant peppermint tea. The night sky above us was completely dark, with only faint, distant stars visibly attempting to shine above the soft, glowing halo cast by the neighborhood street lamps. To this day, I genuinely don't know what possessed me to open up so completely to him that night. Perhaps it was simply the intense, validating way he was looking at me, not with any trace of pity, and not with the anxious worry of a child, but with something far gentler and much more profound. It was a look of deep curiosity. It was a look of pure respect. I wanted to help people because I didn't have anyone to help me. I suddenly confessed into the quiet night air, my voice remarkably quiet. Not when I really needed. Liam didn't rush to say anything in response at first. He just offered a slow, highly thoughtful nod of understanding. His thumb came to rest on the wooden armrest of the bench, positioned incredibly near to my own thumb, not quite making physical contact, but agonizingly close. "You help me every day," he finally said, after letting a long, meaningful pause settle between us. I slowly turned my head toward him, feeling entirely unsure of how I was supposed to respond to such a heavy. He was looking at me, I realized with a sudden jolt, not strictly as a mother, but purely as a complex, flawed person. That entire night, I lay wide awake in my bed, endlessly replaying his quiet words over and over in my mind, marveling at exactly how much this boy had truly changed. He hadn't just changed physically in his impressive height or the deepening timbre of his voice, nor just in the confident way he now chose to physically move through the demanding world. The most profound change was in the specific way he now chose to see me, and terrifyingly, perhaps in the specific way I was beginning to see him too. He was no longer just, he had transformed into something remarkably steadier, something intensely more present. he was quickly becoming a man who had quietly, patiently held the necessary emotional space for me to completely fall apart and painstakingly start my life over. And then, rapidly approaching on the calendar, came his highly anticipated 18th birthday. It was exactly 3 days away when the sudden, undeniable realization struck me that I desperately wanted to do something incredibly special to mark the occasion. I wanted to orchestrate something meaningful that actively reminded him of exactly who we used to be, what terrible storms we had successfully survived together, and the remarkable people we were slowly becoming in the aftermath. I didn't want the day to serve as merely a distraction from our pain, but rather as a genuine, joyous celebration of our resilience. Driven by this desire, I woke up early that morning, long before the sun had even begun to rise. The entire house was still completely quiet, deeply asleep in the pre-dawn shadows. I quietly slipped into a gorgeous flowing navy blue dress that I hadn't dared to wear in several long years. The fabric was incredibly soft at the gathered waist and delightfully delicate along the elegant neckline. It wasn't an overtly fancy garment by any means. It was just wonderfully thoughtful. I took the extra time to carefully curl my long hair, gently dabbed on just a subtle touch of pink blush to my cheeks, and securely fastened the beautiful silver pendant necklace that he had thoughtfully given to me the previous year. The delicate piece of jewelry had a single powerful word precisely engraved directly in the shiny center: grace. Moving to the kitchen, I meticulously baked his absolute favorite cake entirely from scratch, a decadent, rich dark chocolate raspberry creation, generously slathered with a filling that featured just a bright touch of fresh orange zest mixed directly into the sweet frosting. As the magnificent cake slowly cooled on the kitchen counter, I stood quietly by the window, entirely bathed in the soft, beautiful gold of the early morning light, intently listening for the familiar sound of his approaching footsteps. Then I finally heard the heavy thud of his steps, and when Liam casually walked into the room, his dark hair endearingly tousled, and his eyes still visibly hazy with the lingering fog of deep sleep, everything suddenly shifted. He stopped completely cold right in the center of the doorway. He just stood perfectly still and stared intently at me, and within that stretching silence, I saw something incredibly potent violently flicker across his entire expression. It was an emotion that was breathtakingly raw. It was utterly real. He began to step forward, his movements intentionally slow and incredibly deliberate, until he reached me and forcefully wrapped his strong arms around my body, holding me incredibly tight. "I've never seen you look so beautiful," he breathed softly, his voice a rugged whisper near my ear. I tightly held him right there in that embrace, for a very long moment. Liam's arms were securely wrapped entirely around me, as if he genuinely feared I might instantly vanish into thin air the second he decided to let go. This embrace was absolutely nothing like the brief, polite kind of hug you give someone purely out of social obligation. It was a deeply intense, full-body, entirely full-heart collision, and I felt the overwhelming power of it hum through my very bones. He wasn't holding me merely as his mother, but as a grown woman, as a fellow survivor who had bravely stood amidst the burning ashes of a ruined life and fiercely chosen to start completely over. "Thank you," I finally whispered softly against the warm fabric of his shoulder. He pointedly didn't let go of me right away. When he did finally force himself to step back, he locked his gaze onto me. He really deeply looked into my eyes, and I recognized something profound swirling in his gaze that I simply couldn't find the proper name for. It was a complex blend of deep affection, intense admiration, and something undeniably, dangerously deeper. He offered a small smile, sounding a little bit breathless as he spoke. "I can't believe you did all this," he marveled. "I remember what you love," I replied softly, casually gesturing toward the massive cake sitting nearby. His wide smile grew even wider, illuminating his handsome face. "You always do," he affirmed. As I smoothly turned and moved to carefully slice the rich dessert, he purposefully stayed right beside me, remaining so physically close that his hand kept accidentally brushing against mine, purposefully lingering just a fraction of a second too long until the very air occupying the space between us began to heavily shift once again. That familiar heavy silence instantly returned, but this time it felt dangerously charged, feeling exactly like a thick string that had been pulled way too tight, loudly humming with violent tension in the small space keeping our bodies apart. Later, as we quietly ate our rich slices of cake at the small table, I noticed that he kept covertly glancing over at me. He wasn't looking at me like a grateful son respectfully admiring his parent, but rather exactly like someone intensely seeing a beautiful person that they deeply, passionately cherished. And every single time I daringly met his intense gaze, he boldly refused to look away. The unwavering intensity of his stare deeply unsettled me. It wasn't uncomfortable in a negative or bad way, but rather in a terrifying way that made me feel entirely, completely, and utterly seen, stripping me bare to my very core. "I want to do something for you," he declared suddenly, speaking just as I carefully set down his second generous slice of the chocolate cake. "You are eating cake," I playfully teased him, trying to diffuse the rapidly escalating tension. "You are already doing plenty." He immediately shook his head, his dark eyes turning incredibly serious and focused. "No, I mean something real," he insisted. "I want to take you out." I blinked rapidly, confused by the sudden proposal. "Out?" I echoed. He offered a firm nod. "Like dinner, just us." "Somewhere nice," he explained firmly. "Liam, you really don't have to," I protested weakly. "I want to," he countered, his tone remaining incredibly firm, yet wonderfully gentle. "You do everything for me, just let me give you a night." There was an unyielding finality in the specific way he phrased the demand that deliberately left absolutely no room for any further protest. And if I was being completely honest with myself, a massive part of me didn't actually want to say no to him. That evening, as I prepared for our unexpected outing, I found myself standing silently in front of the bathroom mirror for considerably longer than I usually did. I carefully chose to wear a stunningly soft black dress that featured incredibly delicate lace detailing precisely at the sleeves. The overall look was incredibly understated, yet undeniably elegant. I decided to let my long hair casually fall entirely loose around my bare shoulders, and I carefully applied just a subtle, darkening hint of black mascara to my lashes. I wasn't doing this to outwardly impress anyone else. I just desperately wanted to feel exactly like myself again. When I finally pushed open the front door and stepped outside into the cool evening air, Liam was already patiently waiting for me right by the parked car. He was dressed impeccably in a crisp, dark navy shirt paired with clean-cut, tailored pants. His posture was strikingly straight and confident, and the sharp angle of his strong jawline was catching the amber glow of the overhead streetlight just right. Looking at him standing there, he suddenly looked so much older to me. It wasn't merely a change in his physical age. It was a profound shift in his entire imposing presence. The instant he laid eyes on me, his breathing audibly hitched in his throat. "Wow," he breathed out, his voice dropping incredibly low. "You look." I playfully raised a single warning eyebrow at him, cutting him off before he could finish the compliment. "Don't say it," I mockingly warned him, keeping my tone intentionally teasing. He offered a devastatingly handsome smile, but his dark eyes fiercely maintained that same steady, burning warmth from earlier in the morning. "Okay, I won't, but I am still thinking it," he boldly confessed. The nice restaurant he had meticulously chosen for us was wonderfully quiet, a beautiful hidden gem tucked neatly near the edge of the flowing river, featuring soft, sultry jazz music playing gently just beneath the quiet, sophisticated hum of the other patrons' hushed conversations. Our private table was located directly by a large glass window, offering a beautiful view, while a small candle flickered gently, casting dancing shadows in the intimate space directly between us. He behaved like a perfect gentleman. He smoothly pulled out my chair for me and politely waited to sit until I was comfortably seated. He even confidently ordered the meal for both of us, taking immense care in carefully pronouncing the names of the sophisticated dishes that I knew he had diligently Googled beforehand. It was the exact kind of beautiful, quiet effort that didn't loudly scream for attention or demand praise. Instead, it softly, romantically whispered, "You matter." As we sat together quietly waiting for the delicious food to arrive, he suddenly leaned his torso forward over the small table. "I've been thinking a lot," he began seriously, "about you, about everything." I subconsciously braced my body, fully expecting a wave of typical teenage sentimentality. But what ultimately came tumbling out of his mouth was completely different from what I had expected. "No one could have done what you did," he stated firmly. "Held it together like that. For me, for yourself." I immediately opened my mouth, instinctively preparing to deflect the heavy praise and offer the standard motherly excuse, ready to say, "I am your mom. It is what I am supposed to do." But he swiftly refused to let me speak. "Let me say it, okay?" he requested firmly. I slowly, silently nodded my agreement. Beneath the small table, his foot suddenly reached out and gently brushed directly against mine. At first, my mind rationalized that it must have simply been a clumsy accident. But then the pressure didn't vanish. His foot purposely stayed right there, applying just a remarkably soft, incredibly steady pressure against my leg. And when I finally dared to look up from the tablecloth, his intense gaze met mine directly, and stubbornly refused to waver for even a second. "I've never admired anyone the way I admire you," he confessed openly. "You are everything." The incredible weight of that specific word landed entirely differently than I could have ever possibly expected. Everything, and in that overwhelming second, I genuinely wasn't sure what completely stunned me more. The sheer fact that he actually possessed the courage to say it out loud, or the terrifying reality that a hidden, desperate part of my soul intensely wanted to believe that it was true. Feeling suddenly desperate, I quickly reached deep into my purse, feeling an overwhelming, urgent need to instantly shift the intense gravity of the heavy moment. And I smoothly pulled out the small, wrapped gift box I had carefully prepared earlier that afternoon. A beautiful men's watch. It was incredibly sleek, beautifully simple, undeniably timeless. "For you," I told him gently, carefully handing the wrapped box across the smooth surface of the table. He eagerly tore it open, his dark eyes instantly going wide with genuine shock. "This is, wow," he breathed out in amazement. I naturally leaned my body forward across the table, my hands gently grasping his wrist to carefully fasten the sleek metal band completely around it. "It fits," I noted with a soft smile. He slowly looked back up at me, his deep voice dropping to barely a husky whisper. "You always know what fits," he replied, infusing the simple statement with unbearable layers of meaning. Then, at that exact moment, just as I parted my lips to softly start to speak, just as the entire busy world around us seemingly began to completely quiet down and center entirely on the incredibly charged, electric space physically humming between us, I distinctly heard a terribly familiar voice call out from directly behind me. "Chloe," the voice said, adapting Elise for the retelling. I whipped my head around, my racing heart instantly kicking violently against the cage of my ribs. Standing frozen right by the entrance door was my sister, Harper, adapted from Dana. There are specific harrowing moments in your life that instantly feel exactly like frozen still frames, utterly silent, perpetually suspended in time, and forever painfully burned directly into your permanent memory. This torturous encounter was definitively one of them. My sister Harper stood awkwardly planted directly in the busy entryway of the dim restaurant, her body language half physically inside the space, half radiating deep uncertainty. Her sharp eyes rapidly moved, darting suspiciously from me over to Liam, and then slowly back to me again, eventually landing heavily on the incredibly intimate, candlelit space currently occupying the small area between us. She took in the sight of the two totally untouched glasses of fine wine, the overwhelming, quiet, heavy intimacy radiating from our private table, and the damning way his large hand was deliberately still hovering dangerously, intimately close to my own. Sudden, horrifying recognition slowly bloomed across her entire face, exactly like the arrival of a slow, devastating storm. "Didn't know you were out tonight," she finally managed to say, taking a hesitant step further inside, her tone of voice attempting to sound light, but noticeably thick and incredibly tight around the nervous edges. Liam immediately shot up out of his chair, standing up quickly and nervously brushing his cloth napkin completely off his lap while loudly clearing his throat in obvious discomfort. "I was just taking Mom out for dinner," he quickly lied. Mom, he completely hadn't called me that familiar title all night long. Hearing the harsh maternal word hit my sensitive ears, feeling exactly like a desperate backpedaling apology. Harper's sharp eyes deliberately lingered on my face for a torturous beat way too long. Her penetrating gaze wasn't explicitly judgmental, at least not exactly, but it was intensely curious, deeply confused, and highly skeptical in the highly specific, terrifying way that only a biological sister's gaze could ever possibly be. She slowly glanced down at the beautiful black dress I had carefully worn, noting the silver pendant resting elegantly just below my exposed collarbone, and then her eyes darted furiously back to Liam's large hand, which was inexplicably still resting lightly on the delicate back of my empty chair. "Happy birthday," she stiffly offered to him, finally managing to force a highly unconvincing, tight smile that was visibly twitching nervously at the edges of her painted lips. "Thanks," Liam mumbled in reply, keeping his deep voice incredibly low. She simply gave a short, dismissive small nod, and then swiftly turned on her heel and practically jogged away toward the wooden host stand to be seated elsewhere. However, the suffocating emotional space she instantly left behind felt significantly denser and far heavier than the air had been when she first arrived to ruin the moment. I slowly turned my head back to look at Liam. He was intensely still staring directly at the restaurant door, his dark brows tightly drawn entirely together in deep frustration. "She doesn't understand," I softly, quietly whispered to him. He slowly rotated his head to look back at me, and for the very first time during the entire perfect night, there was a tiny brief flicker of genuine hesitation swimming in his dark eyes. "That is okay," he finally declared after a long, painful moment of silence. "She doesn't have to." We quietly sat back down in our chairs, but something massive and invisible had irrevocably shifted in the air around us. It wasn't horribly broken, just fundamentally altered. It felt exactly as if a heavy page had suddenly turned in a thick book that neither of us had consciously realized we were actively writing together. Without any warning, Liam boldly reached his hand completely across the wooden table, and this remarkable time, when his warm fingers gently brushed directly against mine, he absolutely refused to pull his hand back away. His smooth thumb gently lingered against my skin, applying a touch that was incredibly soft, deeply reassuring, and completely undeniably intentional. We didn't attempt to speak a single word aloud. The thick, heavy silence smoothly returned to the table, but remarkably, it wasn't uncomfortably strained. Instead, it was completely full, heavily saturated with absolutely everything we were fiercely keeping unspoken. When the leather folder containing the check finally arrived, he adamantly insisted on paying for the entire expensive meal. His warm hand deliberately brushed directly against mine yet again as he confidently signed the paper receipt, and his dark eyes swiftly flicked upward to meet my gaze head on, not staring at me like a small, insecure boy desperately asking for parental approval, but fiercely looking at me precisely as a mature man who knew absolutely exactly what he was doing. The long drive back to the house was incredibly quiet, but thankfully, it wasn't the agonizing, awkward kind of silence that suffocates you. Instead, it was the specific, beautiful kind of deep quiet that is completely filled to the brim with intense, racing thoughts and overwhelming, heavy presence. The bright neighborhood streetlights passed by the car windows in a slow, steady rhythm, continuously casting splashes of warm amber light completely across the dark dashboard, beautifully catching the sharp edge of Liam's set jaw. He expertly drove the car with only one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, leaving his other hand resting dangerously near the center gear shift, where his fingers were tapping lightly against the console, perhaps out of hidden nervousness, or perhaps simply because he was struggling to hold a massive secret inside his chest. He didn't utter a single, solitary word during the drive, but I could overwhelmingly, tangibly feel it pulsing in the tight air, the immense, undeniable gravity violently pulling between us. When the heavy car finally pulled into the concrete driveway, he shockingly didn't make any immediate move to quickly open the heavy car door. Completely paralyzed by the tension, neither did I. He slowly turned his body completely toward me, his handsome face partially half lit in the creeping darkness, and the raw, intense way he looked at me completely stripped away my breath, leaving me feeling exposed and awed. This look absolutely wasn't the innocent look of a son directing his gaze toward a mother. It certainly wasn't innocent in any capacity. However, my heart fiercely told me that it wasn't wrong either. It was deeply, beautifully, profoundly human. "I meant what I said earlier," he stated, his incredibly deep voice dropping down to barely a raspy whisper. "Which part?" I managed to ask, even though every single fiber of my being already knew exactly what he meant. He slowly reached his hand over the center console, gently, reverently tucking a loose strand of hair securely behind my ear. His warm fingers purposefully lingered directly at my soft cheek, refusing to retreat. "You are everything to me," he declared fiercely. I didn't dare to speak. I absolutely didn't pull away from his intense touch, and when he began to slowly lean his body in toward mine, moving so carefully, so incredibly deliberately, exactly like he was silently asking for explicit permission with every single microscopic inch he crossed, I made the conscious choice to completely refuse to stop him. Our parted lips finally met in a stunning, breathtaking kiss that was entirely hesitant at first, incredibly warm and violently trembling with the overwhelming weight of terrifying things we simply didn't know how to possibly name out loud. The kiss wasn't rushed at all. It absolutely wasn't forced. It was just incredibly, devastatingly real. His large, warm hand gently cupped the side of my delicate face, exactly as if I were something incredibly precious and highly breakable. My own trembling fingers blindly reached up and immediately found the stiff edge of his shirt collar, pulling him closer. There was absolutely no master plan to any of this. There was no written script dictating our actions. There was only the heavy culmination of years filled with deeply unspoken love, shared profound grief, and desperate, clinging survival, all violently melting completely into one single explosive moment that could absolutely never be undone. When we finally, reluctantly pulled our lips apart, he gently let his forehead rest heavily directly against mine in the dark cabin of the car. "I've wanted to do that for a long time," he whispered against my swollen lips. And in the absolute stunned quiet that instantly followed his confession, I finally allowed my battered soul to deeply, entirely feel absolutely everything I had frantically kept buried for so long. I didn't feel an ounce of shame. I didn't feel a shred of fear. I only felt the pure, undeniable truth of exactly what had slowly, inevitably grown between us. It was undeniably something incredibly complicated. It was undoubtedly something vastly unexpected. Yet it was something fiercely, undeniably real. We strictly didn't speak to each other after that earth-shattering moment. Not right away, at least. Not while we were still sitting in the car. Not even as we silently walked up to the house and quietly stepped straight through the front door, both of us utterly caught in the heavy, breathless hush that always universally follows an action that is completely irreversible. Amazingly, it wasn't an uncomfortable, stifling silence. It felt entirely reverent. Liam quietly reached out and locked the heavy front door securely behind us. I reached out and mindlessly flicked the switch to completely turn off the bright lamp sitting in the entryway, and for a long stretching while, we just stood silently right there in the dark foyer, two distinct silhouettes faintly outlined by the gentle, glowing light spilling in from the front porch. Two completely changed people forever suspended together in something that felt far too beautiful and soft to violently shatter. I eventually broke the spell and moved first, gently setting my small purse completely down on the wooden bench, located directly by the bottom of the stairs. He closely followed behind me, his quiet footsteps matching my own, and when I finally turned back around to face him, I found that he was already staring intently at me once again. His dark eyes weren't filled with any fear. They weren't clouded with any confusion. They were filled with nothing but pure, unadulterated certainty. That specific look, the intense, unwavering way his dark gaze entirely settled onto my body, exactly like I was something incredibly holy and entirely sacred, was arguably vastly more deeply intimate than the incredible kiss we had just shared. "I don't expect you to explain this," he suddenly said, his deep voice remarkably calm and entirely steady. "To anyone," he paused. "Not even to yourself, but I know what I feel." I swallowed incredibly hard, my throat suddenly dry. "And what do you feel?" I bravely asked him. He didn't hesitate for a single fraction of a second. "Safe," he answered immediately. "Understood, whole." I knew right then that it would have been so incredibly easy for me to dismissively call this a mere fleeting moment, to cowardly file it away, deep in the recesses of my mind, as a simple accident that was foolishly born completely out of shared pain and constant proximity. But the absolute truth was, we both knew significantly better than that. This action absolutely wasn't born out of sudden impulse. It was a bond that had steadily, slowly grown entirely silently, watered constantly through our immense shared grief, nurtured completely through hundreds of tiny, small kindnesses, and blooming fiercely throughout all the quiet spaces where we had both silently, painstakingly rebuilt each other from the ground up. He boldly took a step significantly closer to me, slowly reaching his hand out once again, and this time, when his fingers gently took hold of my shaking hand, I entirely let him. I didn't do this because I didn't fully comprehend the massive, complicated societal lines we were dangerously towing, but precisely because I entirely did. And despite knowing everything, I absolutely still fiercely chose to boldly stand right there entirely with him. Anyway, eventually we slowly made our way further inside and ended up sitting on the living room couch, completely side by side. The entire house was completely dark, save for the exceptionally soft glow spilling from the kitchen light that was still brightly, the antique clock on the wall ticking faintly in the background. Outside, the cold wind loudly rustled the bare branches of the tall trees. Liam completely leaned his heavy head onto my soft shoulder once again, repeating the exact same comforting motion just like he had done on that emotionally charged night right after we had looked through the dusty photo box. Only this highly significant time, his large, warm hand seamlessly found mine in the dark and tightly held it. "I used to hide in the hall closet," he unexpectedly confessed, speaking almost absently into the quiet room. "When Dad yelled, when things got loud, I blinked rapidly in the dim light, my heart breaking for the little boy he used to be. You never told me?" I whispered. He offered a small shrug against the side of my shoulder. "I didn't want you to worry more than you already did," he explained softly, "but I'd sit in there sandwiched right between the big heavy coats and the dirty boots. And I would just hold my breath." He took a slow breath. "That is exactly what I genuinely thought love was." "What?" I asked, horrified. "Holding your breath? Being completely careful, desperately staying small." I sharply turned my body toward him, my throat growing incredibly tight with raw emotion. "I am so incredibly sorry," I choked out. He firmly shook his head in denial. "You absolutely didn't do that," he clarified firmly. "He did." I deliberately allowed the heavy silence to entirely hold our intertwined bodies for a long moment before finally whispering, "And what do you think love is now?" Liam's warm fingers gently squeezed my hand in response. "It is this," he answered with absolute conviction. "It is being completely seen. It is feeling total peace whenever someone walks directly into the room, absolutely not fear. It is actively showing up completely for each other, exactly when the entire rest of the world absolutely doesn't. We peacefully stayed sitting right there together on that small couch until long past the stroke of midnight. There was no need for any grand confessions. There were absolutely no complicated future plans loudly discussed. There was nothing but our undeniable, beautiful presence completely intertwined. The very next morning, I slowly woke up from a deep, restful sleep, completely surrounded by the delicious, comforting smell of freshly toasted bread and cooking eggs. Liam was already bustling around in the warm kitchen, happily humming a soft tune entirely to himself. When I quietly stepped directly into the room, he immediately looked up and flashed a brilliant smile. His expression wasn't the least bit sheepish. He absolutely wasn't unsure of himself. He was just radiating pure, total warmth. "Coffee's ready," he cheerfully announced to me. "I even saved you the very last of the sweet cinnamon creamer." I beamed a wide smile completely back at him. "You always remember," I noted softly. He carefully handed the steaming mug directly to me, and then he completely paused his movements. "Chloe," he said softly, deliberately using my real first name, which Elise translates to in this story, and intentionally not calling me Mom, whatever inevitably happens next. "I just desperately want you to fully know, this absolutely didn't just come completely from nowhere." I bravely met his intense dark eyes directly without flinching. "I know," I answered simply. "We absolutely didn't attempt to officially define the exact boundaries of what was happening. We didn't try to desperately stick a neat label completely onto it. As I well knew from my time as a therapist, some profound, undeniable truths simply completely refuse to ever fit directly into neat, perfectly tidy little boxes." But starting on that exact day, the two of us confidently moved throughout our shared house completely differently. We absolutely weren't existing together merely as a mother and her son anymore. We certainly weren't existing as some dark, terribly forbidden secret. We were boldly existing as two entirely equal people who had completely, quietly, and miraculously saved each other's lives. And for now, in the quiet aftermath of the beautiful storm, that terrifying, beautiful truth was completely, wonderfully enough.